The invitation to my little sister's wedding arrived wrapped in gold foil, but there was one envelope inside that changed everything. It wasn't a seating chart. It wasn't a heartfelt letter. It was a list. 5 conditions my parents demanded I complete before I would be allowed to attend as family. They expected me to beg. Instead, I quietly booked a beach vacation in Malibu, mailed one final wedding gift, and disappeared. 3 days later, during the reception, my sister opened that gift in front of hundreds of guests. And what happened next was the moment my parents realized they had finally lost control of me forever. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 31 years old, and I own a small event planning company in Seattle, Washington. Most people assume someone who organizes weddings for a living must believe every family gathering ends with happy tears and warm hugs. I used to believe that too. Then I remembered the family I grew up in. In our house, appearances always came before honesty. My parents cared deeply about how we looked to neighbors, friends, and relatives, but what happened behind closed doors was an entirely different story. My younger sister, Emma, could make mistakes without consequences, while I somehow became responsible for keeping the peace no matter who was actually wrong. If Emma lost her temper, I was expected to apologize for upsetting her. If my parents argued with me, I was told to be the bigger person because I was older. After years of carrying blame that never belonged to me, I finally moved to Seattle and built a life where I didn't have to earn basic respect every single day. We still exchanged birthday cards and occasional holiday phone calls, but distance made those conversations easier. It also made me believe time might have softened everyone. So when Emma mailed me her wedding invitation, I genuinely smiled. I immediately called to congratulate her. We laughed about childhood memories, and for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. I bought a meaningful wedding gift, reserved my flights, and even cleared my busiest work week so I could celebrate without distractions. I truly believed this wedding might become the beginning of a healthier relationship. Then my mother called. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. There are just a few family expectations we'd like to discuss before the wedding. 2 days later, I drove to my parents' house expecting an ordinary conversation. My mother greeted me with a hug that felt strangely rehearsed, while my father smiled far too much for someone who usually skips small talk. Emma was already sitting at the dining table, quietly stirring a cup of coffee, without looking at me. My father slid a folded sheet of paper across the table. "Before the wedding," he said, "there are a few things we'd like you to agree to." I unfolded it. 5 numbered conditions stared back at me. First, I had to publicly apologize to Emma during the rehearsal dinner for past family tension. Second, I was expected to give her Grandma Rose's heirloom bracelet, even though it had been left to me years earlier. Third, I would sit with distant relatives instead of immediate family during the ceremony. Fourth, if anyone asked about our relationship, I had to tell them we'd always been a close, loving family. Finally, I was never to mention why I'd moved away or discuss old family disagreements with anyone. I looked up slowly. "Why would you ask me to do this?" My mother folded her hands together as if explaining something obvious. "Because weddings are about keeping the peace." I turned toward Emma, hoping she'd say this wasn't her idea. Instead, she lowered her eyes and stayed silent. That silence hurt more than every condition on the page. For the first time, I understood this meeting had never been about bringing the family together. It was about proving I would still surrender whenever they demanded it. I folded the paper neatly, placed it back on the table, smiled politely, and said, "No." My father's expression hardened instantly. "Then you're no longer welcome at the wedding." I walked out of my parents' house without arguing. The strange thing was, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt tired. Tired of proving my intentions. Tired of chasing acceptance that always came with conditions. By the time I reached my car, I already knew I wasn't going to that wedding. That evening, I canceled my hotel reservation near the venue, requested a refund for my rental car, and opened a travel website instead. 20 minutes later, I had booked a small beachfront hotel in Malibu for the exact weekend of Emma's wedding. If I couldn't spend those days surrounded by people who respected me, I would spend them somewhere I could finally breathe. The ocean had a way of quieting thoughts that had followed me for years. Every morning, I walked along the shoreline before sunrise, listening to waves instead of criticism. Somewhere between the salt air and endless horizon, I realized something important. I didn't want revenge. I wanted closure. That afternoon, I wandered into a small boutique and found a beautiful crystal picture frame that reminded me of Emma. It wasn't extravagant, but it was elegant enough for a wedding gift. Back at the hotel, I wrapped it carefully, then sat on the balcony with a notebook. The letter I wrote wasn't filled with blame. I thanked Emma for the happy childhood moments we had shared before expectations pulled us apart. I explained why I couldn't accept love that depended on obedience. I wished her a joyful marriage built on honesty, respect, and kindness. Before sealing the envelope, I slipped in one old photograph of us laughing together on a summer afternoon. Then I addressed the package to the wedding venue and mailed it. I believed Emma would open it privately. I had no idea it would become the most unforgettable gift at her reception. While I spent the afternoon walking barefoot along the Malibu shoreline, Emma's wedding unfolded exactly as everyone had imagined. The ceremony was beautiful. The weather cooperated. The photographs were perfect. Friends and relatives smiled through speeches and toasts, convinced they were watching the beginning of a wonderful new chapter. Not once did anyone mention my empty chair. Later that evening, during the reception, the gifts were brought into the ballroom. Someone suggested Emma open a few of them before dessert, so everyone could enjoy the moment together. She laughed, agreed, and began unwrapping boxes while guests gathered around with cameras and glasses raised. Then the wedding coordinator handed her one final package. "There wasn't a return address," she said. "It arrived yesterday." Emma recognized my handwriting immediately. The room grew quieter as she carefully untied the ribbon. Inside was the crystal picture frame, the old photograph of us smiling on a summer afternoon, and the sealed envelope. She opened the letter. At first, she read silently. Then her expression changed. The smile disappeared. Her eyes lingered on each sentence longer than the last. Finally, tears slipped down her cheeks. She looked at the photograph again before quietly folding the letter against her chest. Several relatives nearby noticed something was wrong and asked if she was okay. Emma looked toward our parents before answering. Softly, but clearly enough for those closest to hear, she said, "Natalie never walked away from this family." We pushed her away. The conversation around the tables slowly faded. My parents stared at each other, unable to speak. For the first time, there was no explanation polished enough to protect the version of our family they had spent years trying to preserve. That night, while I watched the sunset over the Pacific, my phone began vibrating nonstop. I ignored the first few calls. Then the text messages started arriving. Most came from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. "Are you okay?" "We had no idea." "I'm so sorry, Natalie." I sat on my hotel balcony watching the waves roll onto the sand, reading each message more slowly than the last. For years, I had convinced myself nobody in the family cared enough to notice what had happened. Now I realized many of them had simply never known the whole story. The first call I answered was from my Aunt Linda. Her voice trembled. "I always wondered why you stopped coming to family holidays," she said quietly. "Your parents told everyone you wanted nothing to do with us." I believed them. I shouldn't have. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Sometimes an honest apology doesn't need a long explanation. Later that evening, my phone rang again. Emma. I stared at her name until the ringing almost stopped before finally answering. She was crying before either of us spoke. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have said something when they handed you those conditions. I knew they were wrong, but staying quiet was easier than standing up to them." I closed my eyes. "I know." She admitted that growing up as the favorite child had made her accept things she never questioned. My parents had always convinced her they were protecting the family, and she had mistaken obedience for love. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "I do forgive you," I answered gently. "But forgiveness doesn't erase boundaries." She understood. 1 week later, just after I returned home to Seattle, someone knocked on my front door. I already knew who it would be. When I opened the front door, my parents were standing on the porch. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. My mother looked exhausted, and my father kept shifting his weight as though he suddenly wasn't sure why they'd come. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "You embarrassed this family," he said. I almost smiled. "No," I answered calmly. "You embarrassed yourselves." My mother stepped forward. "We were only trying to prevent unnecessary drama at the wedding." I looked at both of them. "You created the drama." I reminded them that they had written the 5 conditions, demanded I surrender something that belonged to me, expected me to apologize for things I hadn't done, and then chose to uninvite me when I politely refused. "No one forced those decisions," I said. "You made every one of them." My father frowned. "You could have just gone along with it for one day." That sentence explained everything. For 31 years, they had believed peace meant my silence. I shook my head. Real peace doesn't require one person to keep giving away pieces of themselves. Neither of them answered. Instead, my mother quietly asked, "Is there any way we can fix this?" I wanted to believe there was. But apologies without accountability are only requests to start the same cycle again. "I hope you both find peace," I said honestly. "But I can't build a relationship with people who still refuse to admit why it broke." My father looked away. My mother wiped her eyes. Neither of them argued anymore. I wished them well, stepped back inside, and gently closed the door. For the first time in my life, walking away from my parents didn't feel like losing my family. It felt like protecting the life I had worked so hard to build. 6 months passed more quietly than I ever imagined they could. My business continued growing, and for the first time in years, I stopped measuring my happiness by whether my parents approved of my choices. I focused on the people who showed up consistently instead of the ones who only reached out when they wanted something. Emma and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. Not overnight. Not through grand promises. Just honest conversations, patient effort, and mutual respect. Sometimes we'd meet for coffee halfway between our cities, talking about ordinary things instead of old wounds. Those simple moments meant more than forced family holidays ever had. My parents stayed distant. Occasionally, they'd send a birthday card or a short holiday message, but nothing ever acknowledged the choices that had brought us here. I finally accepted that some people never change, and healing doesn't always include reconciliation. One evening, I found the invitation Emma had originally mailed me tucked inside a keepsake box. I smiled, then placed it back where it belonged. Missing the wedding hadn't been the greatest loss. Losing the illusion that I could earn unconditional love from people unwilling to give it had been far harder. But letting go of that illusion gave me something better. Peace. Family isn't built by blood alone. It's built by kindness, respect, accountability, and the quiet decision to keep choosing one another every single day. And that's the greatest gift I ever gave myself.